friends, and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here today, as we generally do, with our large damp square-headed brush. Here, as you can see, we're applying a mixture of titanium white and primary blue to the back of our canvas, and this area is really going to be the farthest away and the brightest blue. As we get farther away in this painting, more light can kind of sink into the water and illuminate it, but as we get closer, we need to subtly make the pigments slightly darker. So here you can see that we're moving on to our first mountain range, and I'm using a medium-sized square-headed brush because it'll allow me to work with a little bit more detail, but the blue's also a little bit darker. I didn't incorporate any black at this point, I just used less titanium white in the mixture to render that pigment. So then I'm going to move on to my next range of mountains, and yet again the pigment is going to be slightly darker. This time I'm incorporating just the smallest amount of a Mars black to darken it up, and I'm beginning by working along the edges, as you can see here. Now we're using the square-headed brushes, as you can see, because they can A, hold a lot of paint, but B, because they have very sharp edges, which is fantastic for working on subjects that are a little bit closer to the foreground and require sharper, finer details. A lot of people generally think to use the round-headed brushes, more specifically the smaller round-headed brushes, for detail work. However, innately, they have fairly feathered edges. They're rounded, and so you can get more of a transparent look, something that's a little bit less fine, and they can't hold as much paint. So if you ever find that you need to block in a large area and also deliver a sharp edge, I'd highly implore you to work with more of a square-headed brush. Now here, as you can see, I'm continuing to block in all of this pigment, and I'm able to blend one side to the other and not let it dry because my brush is fairly damp. It's extending the wet life of the pigment and helping me ensure that it moves fairly softly in the transition areas. Then I'm going to move to the next mountain range, and as you can see here, this time we have a lot of Mars black and a bit of primary blue. We're not using much titanium white in this at all because the Mars black and the blue, or rather the Mars black and the white, would turn into a gray and it would desaturate the blue. Then I'm even taking little pieces of this darker pigment and incorporating them into the backs of the mountains that we just worked on. And as you can see, it's creating a little bit of depth. It's making it look like the mountains and the rock structures down here are receiving a lot of light on the edge, and then it gets darker as they move the other way. This is going to create more of a three-dimensional look. It's going to make it look less flat, and it's going to help ensure that your piece has a little bit of additional realism. You can also notice that I'm applying it more so to the back middle area of them, leaving the edge a little bit brighter, especially next to the really dark rock structures there. And that's intentional because it kind of makes it look like there's a bit of light emanating from that area. Maybe a little bit of light's catching it. Maybe it's steam from under the water or something that can catch light in a little bit more of an easy way. So it makes it a little bit more interesting. It helps each mountain range stand out, and it makes the painting a little bit more dynamic as well. It also ensures that we're not only working with hard lines but soft lines, and the combination of the two really blends well together. Then I'm moving more so to the foreground, and I'm working on more rocks, this time being very sharp with my line work. I need this to be fairly exact, and we're making it extremely dark. It's not a pure Mars black. It does still have a little bit of primary blue in it, but it is only a little bit of primary blue. This is essentially like working with a silhouette, as you can see here. Now, it's also worth noting that I'm using a lot of fairly thick pigment in this as well, and generally I use a damp brush to ensure that I can move the paint around a lot, but that does mean that it also thins your paint, and we really need a thick layer here in the foreground. If you find that you can still see a lot of your line work from your drawing on your painting, you might want to consider going back over different areas with some additional layers. Now here we've used the larger square-headed brush and the medium-sized square-headed brush, but now we're working with the smaller square-headed brush. And I'm using this for the real detail work, much like the whale that I'm doing right here. And I'm able to work around my fine lines, but I'm still able to produce and apply a good amount of pigment. So at this point, it's kind of just like coloring inside the lines because we are working on a silhouette. It doesn't necessarily need a lot of light bouncing around it. And it really gives a great stark image because while we have the dark in the foreground and the light in the top in the background, we're applying the whale more so in the middle of the painting. So it stands out against the really bright background that we just applied. Then I'm going to create some leading lines of fish. As you can see here, they're much smaller and they're coming from the background. This is a way of directing the eye from the background into the foreground where we want it, where our whale predominantly is. Now, leading lines are an important thing in painting and drawing because they help ensure that the viewer's eye goes to and remains where you want it to. And leading lines can be done with just about everything. You can do it with mountains, you can do it with trees, you can do it with schools of fish, as you can see here. But essentially, I'm just trying to ensure that the viewer's eye remains and goes where I want it to. And I'm just kind of trying to direct it with that. So, that's also something worth noting. Another little technique we've been using here is kind of vignetting, and vignettes are essentially a darker edge that goes around a picture that kind of ensures that the middle of it is a lot brighter. The eye will naturally go to the brightest point in a piece, so it helps again ensure that the viewer's eye is going to where you want it to. So you can incorporate both leading lines and brightness and contrast to help you achieve that sort of thing. Now right here, I'm using a medium-sized round-headed brush, and I'm just incorporating a little bit of steam that's being emitted down here at the bottom of these cliffs. And I'm using a fairly bright pigment. I'm using a fairly watered-down pigment, so it's fairly transparent, as you can see. And I'm trying to keep it inconsistent in that transparency. I want it to be changing. I want it to look like different amounts of light are going through it. I want it to look like different areas have different thicknesses, and that's best achieved by using a fairly watered down pigment. If you want to add more and make it a bit more heavy contrasted, then you can simply go back in with additional layers. Now from there, I'm going to take a smaller square-headed brush and I'm going to begin working in some coral in the foreground. And as you can see, much like the smoke, the mist, whatever we'd like to call it, emanating at the bottom, I'm trying to ensure that it's interesting and it's diverse. You never want to create two trees that look the same, two mountains that look the same. Nothing should ever look the same. So here you can see that we're creating different pieces of coral that bend in different ways. And if you look at the piece of coral over on the far right hand side, yet again, it's another leading line. It directs the viewer's eye back into the painting and towards the whale. So that's also important to kind of remain cognizant of. Then I'm switching over to the smaller round-headed brush, and I'm going to work in some light rays from the top of the sky. These are also going to be leading lines, and they're going to be directing us, the viewer's eye, down towards the whale. Now the eye will naturally go to the brightest point in the painting, which means it won't be going to the whale, but rather up here. But because this directs the eye to where we want it, it's okay. It's actually helping us compositionally. Then I'm going to take that same brush, and I'm going to work on some very small, very subtle little bubbles as well. I'm making sure that the application is very thin. There's a lot of water in my mixture so that if I want to increase the contrast and the opacity, I can. But I'm starting off with something fairly basic, something that's not too noticeable, and something that we have a lot of opportunity here to work with, as you can see. So it's quite beautiful. Now, here in the foreground, I'm working on some larger ones, and they're going to require a little bit of detail, but you'll notice that I'm not actually kind of connecting the entirety of the circle, just areas that might catch light and reflect light. We don't want them to all look too complete, or it might look a little bit too unnatural. This can kind of give it a bit of a Disney look, as you can see. It's a little bit more cartoony, it's a little bit more friendly, but I thought it would be a nice addition to show you because it can also act as a leading line. And it's something that works in high contrast with the foreground and the much darker rock ranges, right? So it's something that can really help your piece and kind of deliver a different feel. It takes it from a very dark painting to more of a friendly and playful painting as well. Now the goal here is always to do these paintings in 10 minutes. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes I fail. But I also wanted to show you a little bit more. Today we're going to take a little bit of extra time and I'm going to show you one more good technique to build some depth in this. Here I'm taking the smaller square-headed brush and I'm just drawing in some areas where the rocks will be receiving a little bit of light. I'm predominantly using a Z-shaped pattern and I'm allowing some areas to be much brighter than others, as some of them will be protruding much higher and receiving a lot of light. So it's a quick little technique and you can go back over it with black if you don't like portions of it, so it's an easy fix, but it's a great way of incorporating a little bit of additional depth in your painting. With that said, that is essentially our 10 to 11-ish minute painting. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. And if you like lessons like this, but you'd like to see my color palette, you'd like to see when I'm mixing with water, all of the things we don't have time for in these lessons, I do offer hour-long lessons over on my Patreon that has all of that. It also offers digital sketches, so there's a bunch of content up there. Go check it out. And again, thank you so much for watching. I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.